Dear everyone, I'm very happy to welcome you with us on the occasion of Ulay's online presentation at Richard Saltoun Gallery. And thank you so much for joining us, dear Amelia Jones. Amelia Jones is an American art historian, art critic, author, professor, and curator. Her research specialisms include, among others, feminist art, body and performance art, and identity politics. Jones' earliest work established her as a feminist scholar and curator, including a pioneering exhibition and publication concerning feminist art in relation to debates around Judy Chicago's dinner party. Later, she broadened her focus on other social activist topics, including race, class, and identity politics. Jones has contributed significantly to the study of art and performance, also as an activist. And for her progressive work, she was awarded the Distinguished Feminist Award by College Art Association in 2015. Jones teaches in the Roski School of Art and Design at the University of Southern California. And it is a real pleasure, dear Amelia, to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to start with some general questions, because the online presentation of Ulay's work at Richard Saltoun corresponds with Ulay's critically acclaimed retrospective Ulay Was Here, which is currently on view at Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam until mid-April. And the retrospective emphasizes the importance of Ulay's solo oeuvre, and it positions him as one of the pioneers of performative photography, of Polaroid photography, and also of performance and body art. And Ulay had begun working with the curators on this major survey before he passed away in March 2020. But I feel that the exhibition still seems somehow overdue, because Ulay is widely influential, but in a certain way he's also hidden or concealed, and an example of a difficult artist, of an artist who did not have a signature style. Ulay liked to describe himself as the most known unknown artist. So maybe we start with this. What are your thoughts on what I've just said as an introduction to our talk?
Well, I mean, I think that it's funny to cite Ulay on that, because it's actually the fact that he said that sums up exactly why he has not been recognized fully, while also just being the perfect way of talking about it. Because he, you know, for people who really care about the deep histories of photography, photographic self-imaging, and performance as those interrelate, he's absolutely key. And if I really regret that I didn't know actually his early works from the early 70s, where he was relentlessly photographing himself, because when I wrote my body art book, which came out in 1998, I think it would have been greatly enriched if I had known about that earlier work, because, you know, there was a tendency, especially in the later 80s and 90s in the United States, to see someone like Cindy Sherman as kind of radically putting the body in the field of the photograph. And yet there were a number of artists in Europe, but also a few in the US doing that much earlier. And it was such a cutting edge thing to be doing when he was doing it, that it just didn't really register. And that's often the case, I think, with the most interesting artists who are really pushing the boundaries so hard that they almost can't be apprehended at the time, because it doesn't make sense in terms of what people are thinking about. And I've always been drawn to artists like that. So I wrote a book on New York Dada, where I excavated a kind of marginalized woman, actually also German, who Elsa Plutz, who ended up being called the Baroness von Freytag-Loringhoven, who I kind of argue through the book was so radical that she couldn't, like, it literally didn't read within the teens in New York. And it wasn't until people trained in the visual arts histories like myself started to study performance that her work started to make sense. And I think Ulay is a very similar figure in that there simply wasn't, again, there are exceptions, but there really wasn't a broad-based way to think about what he was doing. It just didn't make sense because he was inventing something. He was using photography to articulate the self or the impossibility of knowing the self.
And he was also an artist without, at least how he called himself, without a signature style. And maybe on this occasion, I would read a quote of his from the last published interview that he did for Art Monthly with Dominic Johnson in January 2019. That really well relates to what you said now and what we just mentioned. He called his oeuvre bizarre. I quote, "My oeuvre is so bizarre. I jump. I'm not a linear, consistent producing artist. For the public, for critics and collectors, and for the market, that is much easier, more convenient. But my ambition is almost the opposite. Each time I do something new, I choose different motives, different techniques, different dimensions, and so on. That can be very confusing, but I like to have joy too. And once it's done, I let it go." So, yeah. Would you agree that a great deal of Ulay's oeuvre, probably like the early 70s and the one after 2004, still needs to be rediscovered and recontextualized?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, if I had the time, and it's difficult because I don't live in Europe, and of course right now nobody's traveling, but somebody needs to look deeply at the archive, but also to study, think more about what was happening in Germany when he came from there, and then also to think about what was happening in Amsterdam and to position that early work in relation to Amsterdam. I mean, we know just from his kind of casual references that he was living on the streets with junkies and prostitutes in Amsterdam, and that has a lot to do, at least as he discussed it with me, with the unbelievably radical cross-gender works that he did, which I kept seeing through the lens of queer performance, because I researched that and I've just written a book on it called In Between Subjects. And Ulay and I would have these back and forth because he would say, well, I don't really think of myself as queer. And I'm like, yeah, but the work is functioning that way. And I mean, I stand by that interpretation, but I also felt the lack of that deeper understanding of that context. So I absolutely think we haven't even scratched the surface in terms of really contextualizing, not in a simplistic psychobiographical way, but in a deeper way of trying to figure out that context. And I do think someone who's German or Dutch would have a better chance of being able to do that, just because you have to understand those cultures in order to understand or even try to think about a historical moment and what it would have been to make that work.
How would you define, if it's possible in a couple of sentences, Ulay's poetics, no matter the medium, as a certain context to say a couple of words before we move on?
I mean, Ulay has really inspired me to articulate the idea of the conceptual body. So I would use that term, that no, the style isn't the issue, but he was at the absolute forefront of pushing a kind of embodied exploration of ideas that was, again, so radical that it often wasn't even perceived, much less kind of written into what was happening, because the art critics at the time were articulating everything in terms of these discrete movements, like conceptualism, performance art, you know, but the really interesting artists, and he's not alone here, were constantly working across those boundaries. Even some of the artists they tried to contain in those categories, like, you know, Robert Morris, who doesn't lack for attention in art history, but really, if you look at his work, he was not just doing one thing or another. He was working across all these boundaries, doing dance works and obviously sculpture and some imagery. So Ulay is absolutely of the moment in that sense of being at the cutting edge of the conceptual body for me.
Okay. I think that's a good base to start our talk now, with focusing on the two works that the gallery will present online. So the first one being one of the most iconic works of Ulay, and undoubtedly also one of the most radical actions in public space in art history. Irritation, there is a criminal touch to art. In German, Irritation, da ist eine kriminelle Berührung in der Kunst. So in this action from 1976, Ulay stole the renowned Karl Spitzweck painting, The Poor Poet, from Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin, and he relocated it to Kreuzberg, to a Turkish immigrant family's living room. And The Poor Poet was at that time a painting that was considered a German identity icon, and also one of Hitler's favorite paintings. And the action was very carefully planned, and it developed, to quote Ulay, from an urge to act. So Ulay wanted to respond to the not solely social, political, and ethnic situation in the city, but also to the artistic one. And he had very radically broke from what he had done previously in the early 70s. I'm addressing the performative photography period and also the series of phototooth performances, aiming to show, I quote him again, what I was about as an artist at that time. So I think that the work presents a special chapter in Ulay's oeuvre. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, it does really stand out because he wasn't doing so many of these explicitly political projects. I think his work is very, has profound political effects, but the politics are very subtle in almost all of his work, except for this one really stands out because it reads absolutely, it's compatible with a more mainstream history of kind of political action-based artwork, especially that was really starting to develop in the 70s, which now we call maybe social practice or you know, combination of institutional critique and social practice. So, I mean, you can look at it two ways. One is within his body of work. It really kind of is this very strange, kind of stands out as a separate, kind of a separate thing. But again, it's also compatible with that conceptual body. And then the other thing is looking at it art historically. Yeah, it's still very much on the cutting edge of something, but it makes sense within that conceptual body work.
I think what you said now about the work being very direct, very politic, maybe more directly politic than other works, is true, and that like Ulay's aim was already so clear in the title. At least this is how I read the work. So there is a criminal touch to art, in a sense that with this action, Ulay attributed to art very clearly the potential for a certain broader impact. So art can directly touch, art can be criminal, art can be subversive. So I think that this action is, yeah, already its title is somehow so narrative.
I mean, his, you know, his titles are always are often very confusing on a first glance for an English speaker, because in fact, the title here refers obliquely to the context of his act of criminality. It doesn't refer to Hitler. It doesn't refer to, you know, it doesn't announce itself as an institutional critique. It announces itself through his deliberate, willful criminal activity, which only results in that critique. So it's actually, you could spend a long time just on the title and how he kind of, and I don't know him as well as you might have known him, but from my wonderful experiences with Ulay, he was constantly deferring attention from himself. And yet, in a funny way, the title actually calls attention to his action.
Yeah.
So there's this wonderful tension throughout his work where he's very, I mean, as a person, he was incredibly funny and kind of dark humor, self-effacing, but the work is constantly putting himself front and center, but not, you know, it's quite complicated how it does that. It's not at all like, you know, Vito Acconci, who is in your face all the time talking about himself in ways you did not want to know. So there's an almost a shyness about the way he insinuates himself into the work. Not even insinuates, because he's really right there, but it's not, none of the work is self-expressive. And that's incredibly profound. I mean, especially for a white man at that time, to make works that constantly feature himself, but are not about putting himself, you know, at the foreground of everyone's attention. I mean, he's in our attention, but we don't really understand who he is or what, you know, what he's doing. And that's one of the things I think that makes the work so radical. And I've written kind of obliquely about that, the way, you know, he comes out of the worst moment in German history as a white German man whose father was in the German army. And what do you do with that? You know, and you could, it would be interesting to look at this, I don't think it's a strategy, but this way that he constantly seduces us, but without giving us that expressive content in relation to being a German man, you know, post World War II. It might parallel a little bit what I've, you know, many, many years ago, I wrote about Duchamp after studying World War I in Paris, where he would have been exactly the right age to be conscripted into the French army. And yet he refused to go and then left Paris. You know, that would have been like a very complex, equivocating moment for, in that case, for a white Frenchman to refuse to fight in that war. So like these are, it's not that we can come up with any answers, but just being more aware of these contexts, I think, allows us some access, or allows me some access to what this kind of seduction, refusal going on in the work.
I think that the point now of you mentioning Ulay's German identity makes sense here, because the action not solely points out the problematic situation with minorities within post-war German society, but also emphasizes Ulay's struggle with his own German origin and the Nazi legacy. And I think on this point, it makes sense to say that Ulay had a very conflictual relationship to Germany, and that in many ways he tried to de-Germanize himself. And he came to Berlin back in the 90s, and he always felt this weight of history. So maybe at this point, it makes sense to address a little bit Ulay's struggle with his own identity. So his identity search as a lifelong process, as a certain red thread in his oeuvre. especially because you wrote about it so wonderfully.
Hmm. I mean, what you said about this particular piece is absolutely kind of what I was building towards is, I mean, what could be more kind of inactive of a conflicted relationship to Germanness, and even an angry relationship to it. There's actually uncharacteristic anger in this piece, I think, that is well placed, right? So, and the way that this piece calls out the class and race hierarchies in Germany is very profound, because very few European artists have really addressed that, even up to the present day. So that was an incredibly brave thing to do. I mean, not the least because he was actually running from the police. Yeah, so, but the identity, I mean, I see his work, I do obsess over identity and kind of the circuits of meaning and desire that circulate for us in relation to artwork. So that's where I'm coming from with that obsession. I would say, from my point of view, Ulay never ever produces work that delivers some identity in any kind of direct way. And again, that's what makes the work so amazing, is we can't have a feeling. So if you go to someone like Cindy Sherman, who's, you know, known for ironicizing identity by performing herself in really exaggerated costumes or guises in her photographic self-imaging, it's a strategy that at least now looks obvious, right? That, oh, we don't know who Cindy Sherman is because she could be any of these personae. But I feel like for Ulay that the identity it's my obsession, but I don't think he was putting that in the foreground. I think he was just living his life and using these tools. And that's what makes his work great, is he couldn't stop himself from, you know, from like at one point in the early 70s, obsessively photographing himself with a Polaroid camera. It's just like what he needed to do at the time. So I see those less as being produced through, you know, oh, if I just photograph myself enough times, I'll know who I am. And more as oh, what does this particular kind of photographic process mean in relation to, you know, how I appear in the world, but also what can I do with it? Oh, well, it's like instantly printed photography, of course, long before digital photography. And so what if I just, you know, for hours, just, you know, photograph myself? And there's no one else, to my knowledge, who was even close to doing that. And it's so raw. It's like, it's literally like he couldn't help himself. He was living this, in some cases, when that moment where he was kind of hanging out with street people, you know, there's a kind of rawness to that exploration that does feel like it's a bigger thing going on than just a kind of very controlled art experiment.
It's, now that we mentioned identity, I read through Ulay's notes for the Shirn show in 2016, and he actually wrote about identity very clearly. So he wrote really nicely, if I may quote, "As moons and seasons and years change, so does my mind. Change, 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 through change consume change, identity through change." So I think that this question of identity and also of what it means to other, either as a different body or either as a different culture, was really present until the end. And he maybe even returned to the question of the female male identity in later works. But to go back to Irritation, because I think there's still some open questions we can address because Ulay was really clear in what topics he wanted to bring into discussion with this work. So not solely the issue of the marginalized part of society, so of Turkish discriminated foreign workers, but also, and I quote him, he talked about it in interviews, also the question of marginalization of art and the correspondence between art institutions from academy to museums. This is pretty visible for everyone who will watch the video online, the video work, also in the predetermined steps that he writes down and that he addresses, announces in the beginning of the video. And in the first step, he actually goes to Hochschule der Bildenden Künste, so to School of Fine Arts in Berlin, and he hangs a photographic banner measuring 2 meters by 2 meters, representing a reproduction of the same painting, so of the Poor Poet, in front of the main entrance of the academy. So this is actually the first step, including the School of Fine Arts in Berlin. Then later on, he goes to Neue Nationalgalerie, and then in the 9th step, he goes to Künstlerhaus Bethanien, so another art institution in Berlin, and he again hangs a photographic banner, a reproduction of the same Der arme Poet painting. So he tries to do a certain correspondence between different art institutions, art homes of art in the city. So can we talk, when we talk about this work, also about a certain institutional critique? Or how do you see this?
Oh, I mean, no question that it functions that way, but that, you know, that term didn't really come into circulation until, I believe, the late 80s, or at least it wasn't commonly used. So, you know, he's kind of inventing a method here that is so complicated and yet so simple. Like, imagine if you were able to follow him, it would have just had a really simple, direct impact. I mean, putting this giant reproduction of Hitler's favorite painting on these 2 buildings, which are art school, you know, related, is just crazy. But it has, if you were there, it would just have this immediate direct effect. Like, it would make perfect sense, especially if you were German, obviously, which most people who would see it would be very direct. So I think there's a difference between imagining that experience of how it played out at the time and what it means for us now. Now it's like this, we look at the list of, you know, plans, predetermined sequence, and it reads exactly like conceptual art, you know, so I do this, I do that, you know, and then this and then that. So that's the beauty of it, is that it functions in these different ways, because it is a conceptual art piece, which ends up being an institutional critique. But it's much bigger than, I mean, it's an institutional critique that relates to the art world and how art is viewed in a society, but it's obviously a deep dig at Germanness, you know, and what it means to protect and take care of this kind of lowbrow realist painting that Hitler loved. And what does it mean that a dictator who kills millions of people can love art, or even supposedly be an artist, since Hitler was supposedly an artist. So there's like so many different levels here that it functions on. Even I, as an American in 2021, you know, can kind of at least see some of those points, but I think it's almost infinitely complex if you really try to get into it, which Dominic Johnson has done a wonderful job.
Yeah.
Really
Dominic wrote wonderfully about the piece, and also he mentioned the important context of the press, of the media, that
yes.
the viewer can also see. Because the event, the action, the act, Ulay never called it a performance, received tremendous amounts of public attention, because Ulay called the journalists beforehand and he let them know what he will do. So I think it's important to point out that it's only via this media attention that Ulay wanted and planned that his artistic symbolic act can achieve its aim and make the public aware. So I think it's something
that's again like so ahead of its time in terms of understanding the role of media in producing political meaning. And so he produces the political effects by creating an event. So it's not just an action, it becomes an event. And the other person in the world I know of who was starting to understand that was Suzanne Lacey, who was doing that out here in Los Angeles. And she was mounting ritual performances about rape, which the key point was that she alerted the media and staged it for news cameras right about exactly the same time. So yeah, it's like, it merges art and activism in a way that is extremely new at this moment.
So this work was conceived in Berlin on December 12th, 1976. Now, before we move to another work, I would just like to give some background information because I think it's interesting. So Ulay conceives this work in Berlin in December, on December 12th. And just a few days before this art theft, he actually already did a performance with Abramović together. They did the first joint performance talking about similarity on November 30th in Amsterdam. And then they both went together to Berlin, where Marina did her Freeing the Body performances and Ulay did Irritation, which actually is the last solo work he did before starting the 12-year collaboration with Abramović. And then they went to Paris. But why did they went to Paris? Because Ulay was invited to present 9 months later this particular work, so Irritation, at Biennale of Young Artists in Paris, Biennale de Jeunes. And they went there, it was September 1977, and Ulay presented Irritation, and this was also the time and place where they did another work we will now talk about, and this is Relation in Movement. And Relation in Movement features even the same Citroën 1 that the viewer can see in the Irritation.
Oh, right.
So it's a whole amazing background story and such an intense period for both artists.
Yeah.
So now we came to this joint period, Marina and Ulay being together, and we come to the beginning of this iconic body of works, Relation works, that they conceived in the period of 1976 to 1980s, 91. One of them being also Relation in Movement, where they are driving for 16 hours until the engine of the van breaks down in the same circle. So can you, as an art historian now, give us the answer? Why are these damn works so epically important pieces in the history of art? What? They're joint works.
Yeah.
Relation works.
But again, you know, they weren't that well known in the United States, which in some ways has dominated for many years the histories of contemporary art, at least in English. Again, I think they weren't really known or talked about, partly because of this issue that the dominant art discourse really wasn't able to accommodate the complexities of Ulay's solo work or of this kind of joint work. So it took, you know, people like me, and I came at it as a feminist in the 90s when I was looking at this work. And of course, within the context of feminism, this just seems like a almost ideal enactment of the male-female relation within the work, but then also between the artists and what they're doing and then the audience. So that's how I initially wrote about it in my body art book. And of course, you know, when I met Ulay and Abramović, obviously separately, they both were like, well, Marina in particular, that had nothing to do with gender. And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter what you think, because the thing is, it reads as a commentary on gender.
Mm.
So I think for Marina to say it's not about gender is naive about, you know, what actually goes on when you perform like that in a context where feminism is starting to have a lot of energy to offer to these discussions. So Ulay, on the other hand, I really always appreciated so much, because he would never say, oh, well, that's wrong, that's not what this was. He would say, oh, you know, that's interesting. I don't think of myself as queer, or I don't, you know, or that's not what I was thinking at the time. And so with him, it was always a discussion that was quite open-ended, which is what I think in an overarching way makes his practice so beautiful and so important, and also is what makes his practice more marginal, because the art world wants the person who asserts a more simplistic kind of formula around what they're doing. It's very difficult for the art world to commodify and contain someone who, first of all, was never thinking about money ever. You know, it was not motivating anything he was doing. He was terrible at actually making money out of his work. And he wasn't thinking in terms of like a singular interpretation or response. So I bring that kind of lens when I teach their work to talking about it, because I've always said you can't, it's not very productive to try to figure out the artist's intentions, because we don't even know what our intentions are. But you can certainly say, this is what the artist said. And you can work with students to say, what do you think? What is this work doing with you? And 100% of the time for students from the late 90s through today, they see gender, you know, being activated as a serious issue within all of these relation works. Now, this particular one, less so, obviously. Most of them after this were much.
This particular performance different from the others?
Because you don't see their two bodies. So, you know, imponderabilia, you see them naked, you know, doing this thing, or relation in space where they're literally colliding. So the students rightly would say, well, how can I not see, you know, a male and a female body colliding? And like, how could that not be about, you know, whatever, gender conflict or gender difference? But this work is, yeah, that is not on the foreground, because it's not what we see. And in fact, this, you know, this was done for a kind of indeterminate audience. It wasn't like, right? It wasn't staged.
There was no audience.
Exactly. So it wasn't staged the way the better known pieces were mostly staged for an audience and documented, and we know the documents. This was almost like a private, yet it's in a public space, but it was an action that had meanings that would unfold over time as people encountered the documentation, I think.
There was no planned audience, no direct witness. I think that you see one casual passerby in the video, but otherwise there's no, it's a piece that's different. I think it's also one of the performances that lasted the longest time. They were driving around for 16 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Night Sea Crossing would last for long periods of time, right?
Yeah, but it would be interrupted after 8 hours or 9 hours of sitting. And here they did not stop for 16 hours. Actually, there is going to be a short audio of Ulay talking about this work on the internet site as well. So on the online exhibition platform. And yeah, he said they didn't stop. for 16
How could,
hours.
so I know that's the fact, but how could they not run out of gas in 16 hours?
This is also the question that Ulay answers in this little short audio, but he said that this engine was just so good and that it ate so little gas that it was possible. But this is the last time they used the van, because afterwards the engine broke down and then they had to get another van.
Right.
That's also the story behind. Before we slowly move to the end, now that we mentioned Abramović, I would like to address one question that I think it's important to the whole body of work of Ulay and to his position as a marginalized artist almost. So after they split, Abramović and Ulay in 1988, Abramović becomes the most famous performance artist in the world, and Ulay almost fades into obscurity. And he was, for years, eclipsed by her. So how do you, as a feminist, see this situation? A male artist not solely being in the shadow, but being oppressed by a woman artist.
I mean, it's a beautiful way to articulate my feminism, which is not about anatomical bodies, it's about power. So the way that I saw her behaving and kind of eclipsing his work, sometimes deliberately, offended my sense of, ethics. So when I finally met Ulay under very funny circumstances, because he mistook me for someone else and he was like shouting at me when I was giving a talk in Ljubljana. And then we had a rapprochement and he was, oh, I thought you were someone else. And we just totally bonded. And so I immediately felt, I mean, I was already feeling, I can't remember the date on that. It would have been around 2000, but I was already really suspicious of Marina Abramović because of my lifelong suspicion of people who put themselves forward in a way that erases subtlety and even tries to control the meanings of the works that they do, which I think is an ungenerous way of being an artist. Because if you're an artist, you're making work, you're putting it out in the public sphere. For you to try to control it at the same time means that, you don't have a generous relationship to the audience. You don't see them as kind of collaborators. Mm-hmm. And so it was that part of her practice that her practice, but also just her self-presentation and the way she was starting to dominate the art world, that I was already suspicious about. And then when I got to know Ulay, I felt, what even went on, that this extremely interesting artist was just kind of pushed aside. And so then I started looking into his earlier work and, my mind was blown. So I think I just appreciate his work so much, but even more so maybe the generosity with which he lived in the world and with which he made art was always about kind of, oh, that's interesting. You have that attachment, and oh, you have this attachment. And again, that's not what the art world rewards. The art world really rewards people who have a packaged kind of practice. And Marina understood that instinctively. And of course, immediately she would move to the place where she could be the most famous. And I'm not undermining the importance of her work, because in a way it is partly that makes the work so interesting, because there is this package. And the Museum of Modern Art, the artist is present, was just like, I couldn't believe that it was like literally summed up in this moment with her sitting there, having basically taken the idea that was part of the Ulay Abramović collaboration and taking it as her own and putting herself in the middle of it, basically an arena with Klieg lights, as if she's the star. I mean, it was like so literal. I couldn't believe it. And that's when I had to write that article critiquing her practice, not so much her as what the art world does with her. So it's like this kind of unpleasant collaboration, because the art world wants nothing more than the person who puts herself in the middle of MoMA and who, even though she's a living body, can be commodified. So I think it's that collaboration that's so distasteful to me. I still think her work is really important and interesting, but I think there's a coldness and a lack of generosity and a kind of fixing that goes on.
It's so great that you mentioned now generosity twice, because I actually wanted to conclude our talk with one of your quotes that has to deal with the issue of generosity, vulnerability, and relationality in Ulay's work. You write a lot about this, and I think it's good to read this quote as an end point of our talk, if I may. You write, Ulay's work is an offering. Thus, for him, his projects are about an exchange of gifts. And these gifts include aspects of himself as conveyed through his performances and self-images. The gift Ulay gives is to encourage us to embrace, or at least acknowledge, rather than disavow, this condition of openness and incompletion.
Yeah.
I think it's a wonderful quote to end.
Thank you. Yeah, that sums up how I feel about his work. And I miss him every day, which is weird because I didn't see him very often, but knowing he was in the world was comforting.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you
for having me.
Thank you to everyone who was with us, and thank you for this wonderful conversation.